go. Hold on. Now I'm recording. Okay. All right. So, kind of as a call to community and a call to action, because I'm yearning for other people who are doing this good work in the world, because there's no simple answer to how we bring people together. And the more of us who have these competencies and these skills, the more possible it is, I think, that we can solve these difficult challenges together. So, I have a question for you. If you're here live and you're willing to answer this question, I'd be grateful. You can unmute yourself or you can put it into chat. But what drew you to this conversation? And if you're listening to the recording, I'd ask you to push pause and actually think about that question. Sometimes we just sign up for something, but we don't kind of, you know, consciously reflect on what's happening in our practice or in our lives that is causing us to seek something in particular out. So, what drew you to this conversation?
Well, aside from you, Steph, it would be that we're seeing more and more of that in our community. And we're planning a large event in the fall that's going to kind of try and address this at a community level. And what does that mean? And really, I think we all know what conflict means, but how can we move beyond that and end it on a positive note and a positive call to action?
Mm, yeah, that's beautiful. Thanks, Jocelyn. And I love that you're pre-planning, right? You're thinking with intention about what could happen and how you're going to create a different kind of space. Thank you. So, anyone else? No obligation, just an opportunity. Thank you, Sigurd. That same longing, and being an IAP2 practitioner, always looking for better and deeper ways. Thank you. And you've always learned from me, Steph. Thank you very much. Carolyn.
I also enjoy learning from you for sure, but I think it's really important for me, being in the space of public engagement and connection with the community, to stay fresh on this. I want to keep learning, keep thinking, and keep just taking that time to center myself as I do this work. And I've changed jobs recently with a new frame on what I'm doing. So it seemed like a really good time to come back to this. So thank you.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you so much, Carolyn. Thank you to all of you for being here, and also to those of you who are listening to the recording. I think we need more folks doing this kind of work in the world. So in January, I delivered a webinar by this same topic, crossing the divide, in times of chaos and polarization. And so in January, I covered this pivotal moment we find ourselves in, right? What's happening around us that's affecting these conversations. And then I covered three things that help you transform conflict: building community capacity, increasing complexity, and stepping into courage. If you've registered for this webinar, you'll get a link to that one too. Even whether you attended live or not, I'll make sure you have the recording of that one. But in this webinar today, I'm going to touch on this pivotal moment, what's happening in the space around us, but I also want to focus on, like Barry Johnson's work in polarity management, right? Where there may or be all these challenges in the space, there are also all these hopeful, beautiful things, right? Two halves of a whole, two poles, just like polarization. And so I want to focus on the hopeful part. And then we're going to cover three more things: how to get the conversation started and then stay in it, right? Rather than getting it started and then be like, whoa, this is uncomfortable, I'm out. Then how to welcome emotion, both yours and other people's, because that is going to be inevitable in the conversation, and how to practice humility versus certainty. So those are the couple of things we're going to focus on. So I'm going to start here on this pivotal moment, and I'm going to go pretty fast because you'll get a link to January where we spent a lot of time on what is happening in the space. So I'm just going to touch on a couple of things that are happening around the globe that are impacting our local individual conversations. So for starters, there is increasing effective polarization. So you know what polarization is, right? Like my way or the highway, yes or no, kind of, my idea, your idea, right? And a space between them. But effective polarization is where I believe this and you believe this. And then I look over at you and I think, you don't just disagree with me. I think you're a bad person. And I extend that further to you're not just a bad person, but I think you're going to do me harm. So I need to, you're a danger and, you need to be dealt with. And so there's a massive dehumanizing factor to the kinds of polarization that are growing around the globe. Distrust is growing exponentially in government, the media, and between each other, between neighbors, between colleagues. It's happening inside organizations, right? A distrust that someone has your best interests in mind, that an organization is working for the collective good. So that distrust is growing hugely. There's a rise in loneliness and disconnection. Huge increase in mental health challenges around the globe. It was there before the pandemic, but it's like it's been amplified since it happened. And even though in some places, some governments say the pandemic is over, but it's still there. It hasn't gone away as a result of that major event. Democracy is on the decline around the globe. And so governments that are being elected or that are taking over, they are less free around the globe. And that trend is increasing. We are experiencing war in places around the world, and in a globalized world, that means we have family or friends who are impacted, or we have friends or family who have friends or family who are impacted. We see the images all the time. We hear the stories. Psychologically, it becomes internalized and it increases, a sense of, lack of safety, a sense of fear. That conflict becomes part of who we are. I've been working with some organizations that are having challenges in the relationships inside their organizations because of wars that are happening. And they're looking to leadership to take a side around the world. Threats, intimidation of public officials is on the increase and the rise. So if you are someone who works in government, then actually your safety can be called into question, and you often feel under siege. In 2023, the World Economic Forum identified that there are every year they make a list of the top 10 risks facing humanity, and in 2023 the number fourth risk facing humanity for the next decade was the erosion of social cohesion. So that's the polarization, that's the divide. But in 2024 that risk moved up to number 3. That's a risk facing humanity, right? We've got misinformation and disinformation as the number one risk facing humanity right now. Extreme weather events is number 2, and societal polarization as number 3. So massive, massive changes. Now, that's a really quick take on sort of what's happening around us. Now, the reason I reference that is because what's happening around us is also happening between us and inside of us, right? That kind of anxiety, fear, anger, disconnect is all around us. And as human beings, we pick that up and we internalize it and it becomes part of our conversations. You probably see it in the reactivity in community or groups that you work with. But it's not the only thing that is there. There are people amplifying voices. There are people demanding to help solve problems. There are people sitting at the table, offering to make contributions to affect change. There are calls for integrity and transparency and a different way of doing things. And so that's the other half of the poll I want us to focus on, because even though all of those things I said about what is happening in the space are true, there are other truths as well. And I think we want to draw on and harness the hopeful energy, because that's an energy that allows us to think transforming conflict is possible. So I want to I want to give you a couple of examples of that kind of energy in the space. You know, we're hardwired from a neuroscience perspective to focus on and yearn for belonging and connection. And so, one of the examples I want to give you, if you live in North America, you may be familiar with this individual. And even if you're not, I think the message is really resonant. So if you have children and you live in North America, there's a possibility that your children in the last 20 years have watched a show called Blue's Clues. And I know that my youngest spent a lot of time watching Blue's Clues, and there's it's about a show about it doesn't actually matter what it's about, but anyways, it's got a human host and a bunch of cartoon puppies, and and the human host for a very long time, he's no longer the host anymore, had a relationship with folks who are now 25 and 30 years old, millennials. My oldest watched Blue's Clues all the way down through my youngest. And he put out a video on social media very recently. And I'm just going to play it because I want you to think about what the impact would be if you spent your childhood with this individual in your living room. Oh, hold on a second. Why aren't we? You can't hear him, right? Hold on. Okay, well, I can hear him in mine. Hold on a second. Okay, let me try it one more time. I'll have to share sound. Yep. Okay. You can you hear him? No. Okay.
Hey, Stephanie, just thinking about
Yep.
last week too. Mercury
Yep.
retrograde is real, and it
Yeah.
is like having a field day this time. The
Yeah.
communication email challenges I've had the last week or 10 days are ridiculous. I'm
Yeah.
blaming
Well,
Mercury.
yeah, well, I am going to blame Mercury. Okay, so I'm going to give you the link to Blue's Clues. So wild. So Jennifer and I were in a session last week, and all the technology that always works didn't work. No, that's the wrong link. Hold on a second. See, it's going to be one of those days. Okay, here is Steve from Blue's Clues. One more time. Let's see if the link works for you and you can hear him. It's very short. It should be done about now. Okay, just give me a thumbs up when you're done. Here's what I want to draw your attention to is, oftentimes we talk about social media and how it contributes to polarization, but I want you to think about, this is just one person who people felt like they had a relationship with, who that they grew up with, who just asked, "Hey, how you're doing?" And I want to just highlight some of the comments. So he asked that question, "How are you doing?" And look at the comments. Not great. I lost my wife on December 17th, 2023, after a 17-month battle with cancer. I'm trying to keep moving as she wanted me to, but it's been really hard. Her name is Tammy, and she's the best part of me. I love her and miss her. How about I'm about to be homeless, Steve, with a 4-month-old, and I don't want to go to a shelter, but I might have to. I could really use a hug. You might want to pull out that handy dandy notebook because, my man, I have a lot to say. Did anyone else stare into his eye quietly and just cry? And here's a dad of a 25-year-old that was a Blues Clues fanatic. You're a national treasure. And I think, and then there's even this contribution. So many of these comments make me want to tell each of you that you matter. And I think there's this yearning for belonging and connection. There's this, optimism, this positivity. There's this reaching out to each other that in times of polarization and chaos, we need to harness. We need to step into. We need to think about how do we create those spaces where we're really, really present with each other. I want to give you another example. So this week, we experienced the oh my God, honestly, I run these sessions all the time and I have never had technological problems like I am having right now. Where are my slides? Here we go. Okay. All right. So one of the things I want to highlight too is that sometimes there are moments that allow us to step back. So that's an energy that gets created because something bigger than people, is happening than the small, mundane, commonplace things that we focus on and we fixate on. And sometimes they allow us to think about, how much more beautiful the world is than we think it is. So harnessing some of that energy, like the energy of the eclipse, right? It doesn't matter what part of the political spectrum you were on or what challenge you were having, you came together to just witness the wonder of the universe recently. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Valerie Carr. So she is a social justice activist who has really practiced something called revolutionary love. And just in the interests of not having more technical glitches right in this moment, I'm going to put her TED Talk into chat. So there's a moment in her talk where she says that the antidote to these times of rage that we live in is love, which is a quite counterintuitive message, right? But when we can practice empathy and kindness and possibility in the face of rage, we can shift the conversation. If we meet rage with rage, well, then we just have more of that, right? We amplify it and we make it bigger. So I've given you the link. I was going to play a couple of minutes of it, but I'll leave it where it is for right now, and you can look at it afterwards. So that brings me back to how do we bring people together? So if you know my work, then you know that I believe that brave, honest conversations are how we solve the problems in our organizations, our communities, and our lives. But that's because the conversation is the conduit to connection, to understanding, to trust and relationship. And when those four things are present, we can solve any problem. And when those four things are not present, we can do just about nothing. And so I think it's really important that we think about where we put our energy, because whatever we put our energy on is the thing that grows in the space. So if we focus on our fear or our worry about that divide, or where people are in terms of polarization or what's the level of the conflict, we kind of amplify it. But if we can focus on what's the common ground, how do we create connection and relationship and bring people together, then we create the possibility that we can shift the conflict. So let's start with get the conversation started and then stay with discomfort. So let's start there. I want you to think about the relationships and groups that you are a part of in your work, in your life, in your community. What are the conversations you need to have, but you haven't had, but that you haven't started yet? So just take a moment and reflect. You don't need to share, but I think that there are always conversations we need to have. Now, my husband will tell you that we don't have to talk about everything, and he is probably right. But there are things that when we avoid them, They create a barrier between us in our lives, in our organizations, right? They create this kind of disconnect that happens. And then, of course, in our communities, they create the exact same thing. In the last couple of years, I've had to have conversations with my family. My parents are aging and their health is declining. And so we are kind of in the middle of a conversation like that. My husband and I are avoiding a conversation about selling a house that we have, because that means, that part of our life is over and finished. And so we're actually pretty consciously saying we need to talk about this and then absolutely not talking about it. I have a conversation I haven't started yet with an organization that I work with pretty regularly that consistently and repetitively says this is what they stand for and these are their values, but their actions would demonstrate quite different. And I just feel such a tension in my involvement with this organization, right? I believe in those values, and yet my experience is the exact opposite of that. So I'm struggling with, how do I have that conversation? How do I even start it without, worrying about all the repercussions that might come to initiate that conversation? In the last couple of years, in my life, I've had conversations about death and dying and mental health and money and parenting and sex and neighborly choices. And by that, I mean the choices my neighbors have made that I'm not happy about: healthcare service delivery, energy and the environment, natural resource extraction, municipal budgets, trust and credibility by community, and organizational culture. And so the bottom half of that list is my work, but the top half of that list is my life. And so sometimes it's hard to figure out, where do you even start the conversation? Inherent in having these conversations is how we look at conflict. And so conflict is, opposing, kind of stuck views, that idea of polarization. But if you choose a different kind of mindset and you think about conflict as a signal that something needs to change, if you hold that definition, then you're holding the mindset of hopefulness, of optimism. You're holding a belief that it is possible to have the conversation. I think that I wrote this quote down from a facilitator I hugely admire. His name is James Gill. He says the greatest mistake we make in conflict is not allowing both our experience and their experience to be acknowledged and recognized. And that's, the opportunity, I think, that gets presented if we are thinking about conflict as hopeful. Yes, I can say that again, Jennifer. The greatest mistake we make in conflict is not allowing both our experience and their experience to be acknowledged and recognized. Right. And when we use the word experience, we're talking about the whole of the other person, not their position, their view, or their stand on that particular topic. We're talking about their experience that led them to that view, right? The values that they hold, the things that they believe. And so I think if we hold a mindset of possibility, then we can make choices that create the potential to have these conversations. So I would like to ask you, how do you begin? If you thought of a conversation or multiple conversations you need to have, what's one sentence you could say that would initiate a brave, honest conversation? And if you're here with me live, I welcome you to put it into chat. And if you don't want to, I just welcome you to think about it. What is one sentence? Like, how would you start? What would you even say? How do you begin? Because sometimes that's the hardest part, right? We think, okay, we got to have this conversation, but then it feels uncomfortable and awkward. And so, where do we even begin? So I'll just give you 30 seconds. If you're listening to the recording, I want you to pause it right now and just think about, what is one sentence you could use to begin. All right. I want to give you some examples. Maybe they'll be the same as yours. Maybe they'll be different. Here are some of the ways I have begun. Not saying I have the answers, just saying, here's the ways I have started some of those conversations. I have something I'd like to talk to you about. I'm hoping it will help us work together better. I'd like to talk to you about this, but first, I'd like to hear how you feel, see, or experience it. I think we might see this situation differently. I wonder if we could talk so we understand each other better. I'm struggling with how things are working right now. Could we talk about it and figure something out that works for both of us? And it's taken me a little while, but I've gathered my courage and I want to talk to you about this. Could we schedule a time to talk? There's some themes and similarities in some of those ideas about starting a conversation. Yeah, you like that last one, hey, Jocelyn? It's interesting because they center our own vulnerabilities, right? They bring us wholly into the conversation. I want to read you something from my book that is about the quality, I think, of the conversations we want to start. What is the difference between transformational conversations and transactional conversations? Sometimes the differences are easy to spot. Discussions about to-do lists and errands to run and who will pick up the children from school versus discussions about how I'm feeling lonely and I miss you, even though we are here in this house together. There are conversations that generate lists about deliverables and due dates, timelines, and tasks versus how we leverage our individual strengths to do good work that makes us feel a sense of purpose and accomplishment, like our contributions matter and we have value. There are discussions about construction impacts of community infrastructure and when there will be night work and loud noises versus conversations about how the baby is up all night and work from home has become impossible with no respite from the noise and mental health is suffering in our community. We know these conversations, we've been in them. It seems the more stressed and pressured some people get, the more we veer towards transactional discussions, as if controlling the details will bring us back to safety and certainty. Instead, they leave us feeling empty, hollow, hopeless, unseen, and undervalued. So, the quality of our conversations when we start them, we want transformational conversations versus transactional conversations, not lists and checklists and spreadsheets, but what brought you to this moment where your heart is aching and you're struggling, right? Those quality of conversations that prioritize relationship and the whole person. We need to recognize that while we don't have to talk about everything, the things we don't talk about, we can never solve. We can never address. So they have the potential to cause us harm. And it's important to recognize that just because you're ready to talk doesn't mean the person on the other side of the conversation is, right? You might have spent lots of time gathering your courage, but that doesn't mean that they have yet. So we need to allow time for people to process the idea and to prepare themselves. And we need to ask ourselves, why are we having this conversation, right? Are we having it to persuade someone of a given viewpoint, to, convince them of a way forward, to be right? Or are we doing it because we're really embarking on a curious, hopeful, inquiring kind of discussion? And that means that we've got to be vulnerable about our side of it, not in a way that says, I'm feeling anxious and you made me feel that way, right? The letting go of blame and judgment, just I'm feeling anxious. And here's my hope for this discussion. So there's starting, and then there's thinking about the quality and the purpose of the conversation we're engaging in. So, how do you stay in discomfort, right? Because you've got the conversation started. And then now you need to think about, okay, how are we going to stay here? How do we stay long enough to figure out how we're going to move forward? And I deeply love this Viktor Frankl quote that between stimulus and response, there is a space, right? And that's really what we're trying to create is that pause that allows us to stay because inevitably these kinds of conversations are uncomfortable, right? They generate all sorts of physiological responses to us as soon as that discomfort arises. And so I think, for example, like For me, I can feel my stomach churning. I can feel, the heat rising in my body. I get a little sweaty. Sometimes my heart starts beating fast. And that's a sign. Sometimes it's a sign that I need to get out of here and I need to end this conversation. But if I can stay and raise my awareness of it, it's an enormous opportunity to go through the hard stuff to the other side, right? That idea that you have to go through the trench to get to the other side. That's the opportunity. So, knowing how you yourself will stay, it's going to be different for each of us. This is how I stay. I breathe. That's it. I breathe. I take consciously in the middle of these challenging conversations, I take really deep breaths. Soon as I start to feel like the flush coming up and my stomach churning, but then I notice, I've trained myself to just ask myself in my own head, what is going on here? But when I'm with a group and you can feel that in the space, you can feel the energy in the space, you can also ask that question. You can say, let's just take a pause for a second before we, continue our discussion and notice what is going on for you at this moment in this conversation. What's happening right here in the space between us? Because that allows people to stay with the discomfort, because our natural reaction to discomfort is to make it wrong. Soon as we feel uncomfortable, we point to how that other person or this situation is bad. And we need to kind of cast our suffering on them, right? And that it needs to stop. And so can we soften into the moment instead of harden with judgment? And the only way I can explain soften into the moment, right, is can I notice what's happening for myself and then just make friends with it? Be totally open to it. So if I'm feeling like I'm going to throw up and I'm super anxious about this conversation, then just own it. I'm really struggling and I'm feeling anxious about this conversation. It's this idea that if we turn away from our pain, it will break us. But if we turn into our pain, it will break us open. And that's just an astonishingly different way, I think, of thinking about the discomfort that happens in these conversations. And it's grounded in the emotion that we experience in these really difficult spaces. So I want to kind of transition into talking about emotion, yours and others, because emotion is always present in these difficult conversations. So here's two questions for you. If you're listening to the recording, I want you to pause and really think about these questions. What emotions of others generate the most discomfort for you? So when people show up in conversation in your life or your organization, or when you're leading conversations in community, and what emotions of your own are hardest to be with? Oftentimes they're the same or they're similar, right? The most common ones I think people struggle with are rage or grief or despair. And I think anger and community. Yeah, thank you so much. The yelling, the screaming, right? The intensity of it, right? That just, how it feels like almost like a threat to our safety. And maybe it is a threat to our emotional safety or our psychological safety. I think when we do this kind of work, when we have these conversations, we kind of need to practice this idea that if we can touch the feeling inside of ourselves, if we know what that feels like, then we can create space for other people to bring it, and then we can talk about it. But if you can't touch it inside of yourself, it's very difficult to create a space for other people to bring it, because it just increases your discomfort. So in the last couple of years, I referenced at the beginning, I've really struggled with burnout and some despair. In the last couple of years of can we actually shift this work? It's why I wrote my book. But also, I've had menopause, just too much personal information layered on top of it. And I have to tell you, the despair has been astonishing to me. And so, but because of that, I actually kind of see it as a bit of a gift, Like I can touch that place so deep and dark inside of myself that what I have noticed is that kind of gathering around me are people who want to talk about those things because I think maybe I'm friends with it inside of me. So then there's a space. Come on, bring yours and put it on the table. And so when we can do that, then we can explore things and figure it out. But if you are have a really hard time, say, with public anger, then it's really hard to engage that participant, that community member in their anger, to welcome in their anger and to find out what it's pointing to. Where is it, sending you? What's causing it? What's been their lived experience or their challenges or their story or their perception that has gotten you to that place? I like to think that we do our best work with emotion when we believe that you are all these things and so much more, right? So I'm not only, despair. I am also joy and frustration and excitement and anxiety. I'm all these things. And when you expand your own range to be comfortable with those kinds of emotions, you can expand the range for other people. So I want to just read you one more thing from my book. It's just actually a couple of questions, I think, that are really helpful to allow us to think about how do we embrace the fullness of the emotion that we might be experiencing. What if we embraced the fullness of our emotions? Imagine if we each embraced the full spectrum of emotions, inviting light as much as dark in these times of challenge. What if we each cultivated joy and positivity as an antidote to fear, grief, and anger? What impact might this have on each of us personally and on those around us? Emotion is at the very center and heart of our relationships, experiences, perspectives, and the truth we hold about how the world works. Emotion escalates or de escalates conflict. Emotion is core to every part of the human experience. When we work with our emotions, we perform better, are more effective, connected, and more capable. And so I think there's just such opportunity from a neuroscience perspective. We call that integration, right? It's where not just one part of your brain is operating, but actually where you have access to the whole of your range and your capacity. So it's like practicing emotional integration, which creates a space for other people to bring what they want. I wonder if I dare to play this video. I think this is one of my favorite songs. I think Leonard Cohen says it best. No, I don't dare, do I? You can't hear it. What is happening with the internet right now?
Did you click
Oh,
share computer sound?
I did.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And see, as soon as I take it off sharing, it's, you can hear him. I'll just put it into chat. There's a line in this beautiful, beautiful song. It is absolutely Mercury in retrograde. Okay, there's a line in this beautiful, beautiful song. It's one of my all-time favorites that says, "There is a crack in everything. That is how the light gets in." And I think that's just, I mean, it's one of my favorite quotes, but it's also such a crucially important concept when we think about how do we work with emotion, ours and other people's, right? Emotions are signposts that allow us to make sense of what is happening, to make meaning and to welcome them in so we can explore them and understand them and stay with the discomfort that they create is such an opportunity rather than a challenge, rather than a thing that's contributing to the chaos. It's actually just a capacity of expansiveness, I think, to stay with the conversation when it is uncomfortable. Okay, so I'm not even gonna try it. I wanted to share a story. So I don't know if you follow the podcast Moth Stories. Beautiful stories that human beings experience, and I'm going to put all these chats in the follow-up email with the recording, all these links. Anyways, there's just a link there to a really beautiful story about believing in the possibility of the conversation despite uncertainty and being in a conversation with a stranger and totally different worldviews. So you don't need to watch it right now, but it's a really beautiful example of of exactly the emotion, the discomfort, the starting the conversation, the staying present. It's a really beautiful example of that. So I'll just pause for a second. Welcome back, Brittany. I'll just pause for a second and see if there are any any questions or comments before we go into thing number 3, practicing humility. And thank you, Jennifer, for your comment in chat about everything being glitchy, because I'm really glad it's not just me. And I ran all these things this morning, and of course, everything worked perfectly fine.
Can I throw something in there?
Yes, please.
I'm just thinking that very often when I'm in the role of or in the service of a facilitator, that even though we can have excellent conversations, I find myself often wanting to go deeper, but feeling, is this the right context organized by some government institution? I know there is this level of conversation with the client before, but I also find that, there is to some extent, a resistance in so many of us when we come together in a community to talk about issues that do matter to us, but somehow to stay more on the surface. It's just a thought, if that's something you want to say something about. It's not maybe that, yes, there can be conflict, but not like at the level of really rage or that sort of strong emotion, but I so often wanted to go deeper.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I can so relate to that. So I'm going to answer it by telling you a short story. I did a session 2 weeks ago with a provincial government in Canada and all of their leadership team. So there, I think there was like, and from the entire department. So I think there was like 84 people involved from that very top of the department down through all the director levels. And the focus was on bravely leading challenging conversations. And people were really receptive to the idea until we got to the part about emotion. And as soon as we started talking about emotion, there were not everyone, but a couple of folks who were super resistant. Like, okay, that's all well and fine, but I would like to talk about how we get better results. How do we improve performance? How do we deal with, people who are not doing their job? Like, give me the top 10 checklist. And I think what that points to is this programming, I think, a social programming that we have, that when we go below the surface level, it creates discomfort. And it means also it's also about us, just like Jocelyn has just said in chat, it personalizes it. And so it becomes not about the topic, it becomes about the people. And yet, Sigurber, I think that is the answer. Doesn't matter whether there's conflict or not. That is actually the answer to building strong communities, to making sustainable decisions, to being able to move just about anything forward, is when we center people, not the topic or the project. And so that means going deeper, evoking questions that allow people to tell their story, that allow them to bring their whole selves, that allow them to bring the grief and anger, frustration, anxiety that goes with those stories to the conversation. Because once we do, right, we have not just accomplished the client goals of having that conversation on that topic, we have connected people to each other. We have deepened understanding. We've built community. We've built capacity to talk together in a different way. And those second order goals, I actually think, are more powerful than the first order goals. But we can only accomplish sometimes those second order goals with the focus of the topic or the first order goal, right? We're bringing people together for this purpose. But now let's also accomplish these other things. I think that's the best of this work. It is the very best of this work. And the interesting thing is that whether people agree with what happened in the end or not, they walk out feeling seen and heard and valued and all the rest. So it changes the perception and the relationship, or shifts it anyways, with the organization and people, right? They have the experience, a heart-centered experience of being in conversation, and they come back again and again for that, rather than a conversation that was good and facilitated well, and they got to hear what their neighbors said, and then they're done and they go off to their other things. Yeah, that's such a beautiful question. Thank you for asking it.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's talk about humility. So now I think it's really important to think about, in these webinars, I always focus on competencies. And competencies are the skills we hold, so the things that we do. They are the knowledge we have, the things we understand, and they are ways of being. And lots of times people come to this work wanting to, give me a couple more skills and tell me the top 5 things I should know. But I always highlight a way of being, because I think that ways of being are as equally as important as the skills and knowledge that we hold. So in the January 17th webinar, we focused on courage. And this one, we're focusing on humility. So I want you to just take a moment and ask yourself, how would you define humility? Like, what does it look like? What does it feel like when you are humble, or when someone else is humble? What's the impact or the outcome of humility? Right, it's one of those words like sustainable. We all maybe have a different experience or a definition of it. I'll just pause for a second if anyone wants to offer one. And if you're just listening to the recording, I want you to kind of think, what does that look like or feel like for you? Mm, thank you. That's beautiful. Knowing that it's not about me, listening, opening the heart. Like you can feel that when I read that, I feel the expansiveness of it, right? Just the possibility. So I want to offer a definition that is not my definition, and comes from one of my favorite authors. So this is Richard Wagame's One Story, One Song. And so he defines humility like this: the old ones say that humility is the foundation of everything. Nothing can exist without it. Humility is the ability to see yourself as an essential part of something larger. It is the act of living without grandiosity. Humility in the Ojibwe world means like the earth. The planet is the epitome of a humble being, with everything allowed the same opportunity to grow, to become. Without the spirit of humility, there can be no unity, only discord. Humility lets us work together to achieve equality. Humility teaches us that there are no greater or lesser beings or things. There is only the whole. There is only the great, grand clamor of our voices, our spirits, raised together in song. I just think that is exceptional, right? The focus on unity, on the whole, that the humility is the foundation of everything. I think you can't have a brave, honest conversation without humility. right? Otherwise, we have already decided what the outcome of the conversation is, right? Brave, honest conversations are inherently uncertain without a course charted. We don't know what the end of them will be. They're full of discomfort and emotion. And so I think our ability to be humble to what the power of the conversation, the beauty of the conversation itself, is the thing that makes them possible, knowing that there's not a right answer to the question. I want to offer that, this is an introduction approach I have used actually pretty regularly. And I think, it creates this space where humility grows. Like if we were to do introductions again in this session or at any time, we'd ask people to let's remove the trappings of role, title, position, or work activities. And so let's center the human beings in this space. Just tell us something about you as a person. And so what would you offer to the space? Because what it creates, right, is this powerful space of vulnerability, this powerful space of openness that is quite different than the way we introduce ourselves otherwise. I would say if I was to, reintroduce myself to you, I would tell you and to tell you something about me as a person. Crazy crocheter. I love that, Jocelyn. That's beautiful. That's beautiful. I would tell you that I didn't sleep well last night because I have a son with a couple of friends. I have four amazing humans who are my children, but in particular, I have this one son right now who kept me awake last night, or who I stayed awake worrying about, being anxious about, because he and some friends are on the Monarch ice field right now, which is in the interior of BC. It's a 4-day trek in with all their gear on sleds. And last satellite phone message from him was that they were in a snow cave sitting on a storm. And they were hoping to retreat on the glacier. They're on the glacier and they're hoping to retreat a couple of days early, but they got to wait for the storm to end. And so, me as a human being, as a parent, I can feel that tenuous thread to him out there. And so that's kind of running in the background of my head. And so that's a thing, I would offer about myself. Creates a different kind of space for conversation. And I think the other thing it creates when we introduce ourselves as the things that matter to us or the things that are running through our heads is that it creates attunement, or sometimes we use the word alignment. I often use the word resonance. They all mean the same thing. They mean that we're creating a space that says, I get you, right? I see you. That's the thing my husband often says to me when I'm struggling. Okay, just stop for a second. I see you. So what do you need me to understand? And that we can have skills and theories and techniques, but when we are engaging people in these challenging conversations, you should just be another human soul who is touching another human soul. And that's the thing that gets us through that trench, right? That gets us, the conversation is the conduit to connection, to understanding, to relationship and trust. And so just offer that as kind of food for thought, right? The ways in which we gather, they have an impact on what happens at the other end of our conversations. This is, I think, one of my hardest learnings over the course of my career, but probably the truest one, that I've learned that how you show up and what you stand for matters most in these conversations. Not your knowledge, role, or position, not your answers or the technical details. The energy and emotion I bring to this conversation impacts the space. Can you be loving and kind when others are full of rage, anxiety, and rigidity, right? Valerie Carr, that I put the link into chat to her TED Talk, talks about it like revolutionary love as an antidote to a time of rage. Can you set boundaries with a generous heart when others are rolling with chaos and fear? Can you invite people to find their feet in discomfort and fear and stay long enough to seek the meaning and the wisdom the experience presents? I think it comes back to how we show up individually. Because that's really most often it's the only thing we can control, right? Not other people, not how they perceive us. The only thing we control is how we show up, right? How we engage, how we create the space, how we invite them, how we give them something to be for rather than something to be against. It's that how we go deeper, how we, focus those our engagement to include those second loop experiences versus just the purpose of our processes. So those are just a kind of couple of thoughts about humility. It creates this astonishing positive power, I think, in our engagement processes. I just leave you with these last couple of thoughts. There is no perfect way to do this work. There is no checklist to doing it. It is complex and uncertain and chaotic and messy and beautiful and possible and astonishing. And so I think a measure of your success is your commitment to trying, not how perfectly you do it. Call people in, embrace the discomfort, support people to stay in the conversation by even noticing when the discomfort is rising for them. Right? What does this mean? Even making light of it. Okay, anybody else feeling a little sweaty right now? Let's just pause and notice that. Means it matters, right? Means we're really talking about the real thing. Create patterns and experiences of talking together that feel different than the kinds of conversations that are transactional. Show up with courage, compassion, humility, and lead from those commitments, the things you believe in, on the space you create, the why you're having these conversations, and center humanity. That's it. I have my usual invitations to join me for training if you want to deepen your learning, to work together on in-house conversations and capacity building, to read my book. All those things if you're here and you signed up anyways. So let me just pause. The questions, comments, yearnings. It's such a deep, deep space. How do we cross the divide? You're so welcome. Oh, I'll just say thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop the recording.